The town of Gallows Bend was the kind of place the sun yawned over, slow and dusty. The wind whistling down the narrow street like it had nowhere to go, and no one to hurry for. On the edge of town, where the wooden porches creaked like tired knees and the prairie stretched out like an old quilt with too many patches, a little girl sat on a crate outside the dressmaker's shop. Her boots swung just above the ground, scuffed, and one lace missing. In her small hands, she held a mug of warm milk, the rim chipped where someone else's lip had once rested. Behind her, a woman tall, but slightly stooped from years of bending and sewing and hoping, lifted a basket of linens into the doorway. Her hair was pinned in a hurry, and the blue of her dress had long faded into the color of washed-out skies. She didn't speak much these days, but when she passed her daughter, she rested a hand on her head, soft and lingering, like a prayer left unsaid. They had come by wagon weeks ago, though it felt longer. No one remembered seeing them arrive, not really, just that suddenly they were here. Two shadows among many in a town, where people came and went like wind through tumbleweds. It was the girl who made folks stop and notice. She had those wide, watchful eyes that seemed so knowing for someone so small. And when she smiled, which wasn't often, it felt like spring had poked through the frost. Just for a breath or two, the woman found work with the old seamstress who owned the shop. Needle and thread paid little, but it paid. She worked quietly, steady hands mending the broken, just as she had done for herself 1,000 times. She didn't ask for charity. She didn't ask for much of anything. People whispered, another widow, with a child, another broken family. She walked with her chin up, but never too high. In towns like Gallows Bend, folks didn't mind strangers, as long as they stayed humble, stayed quiet, and didn't ask for more than their share of sky. There was a man in town who noticed her early on. He wore a badge and a polished smile, the kind of man who looked handsome from far off and hollow up close. At first he brought small kindnesses, a slice of peach pie wrapped in wax paper, a polite conversation outside the church steps. He made her laugh once, just once, and that seemed enough to give him permission to think she might belong to him someday. But over time, his tone changed, grew distant, colder, when he asked about her past, where the husband had gone, whether she had land or family, and she answered with silence and a soft shake of the head. His interest wilted, like a flower left out too long in the sun. He wanted someone easier to hold, someone not already tired, someone not burdened by a child who called out in the night for a father who wasn't there. One day he didn't wave at all, and that, somehow, hurt more than if he'd spat at her feet. She didn't cry over it. She hadn't cried in a long time, but her daughter saw. Children always see. They made a life, the two of them, quiet and small, but stitched with care. In the mornings, the girl swept the shop and helped organize spools of thread by color. She spoke to the mannequins as though they were her friends, and sometimes made up stories about the dresses her mother sewed, that this blue one was for a princess who had lost her crown, or that yellow one for a lady who would find love at a picnic. The woman never told her to stop dreaming. Sometimes, she paused her sewing just to watch her daughter tell those stories. And sometimes, just for a flicker, the woman remembered who she used to be. The one who danced barefoot in riverbed, who once ran through tall grasses with her hair undone and nothing to fear but the dark. Then one day, something changed. It was a Wednesday, the kind where heat hung heavy, and even the cicadas were too tired to sing. The girl stood outside the grocer's stall, clutching a coin for bread, when she saw him. A man on a chestnut horse, broad shoulders, weathered coat, boots dusted with the road. He didn't look at anyone, just tied his reins, stepped off, and walked inside the general store. He didn't speak to the grocer, just pointed at what he needed, nodded, and left coins on the counter. The girl stared after him as he rode off again. Not fast, not slow, just quiet. Like he didn't want to disturb the earth more than he had to. That night, over a dinner of beans and hard bread, she told her mama about the quiet man. He didn't smile, she said, but he didn't frown either. He looked like he's made of old wood and stars. The woman chuckled, a sound she hadn't made in days. The seamstress said his name once, just once, and no one asked more. Rancher keeps to himself, lives out by the canyon ridge, been alone ever since. She never finished that sentence, and no one asked her to. The girl began to see him more, at the edge of the church steps, as he dropped off. Donations without staying for service. By the well at dusk, offering his place in line to a mother with twins. He never stayed long, but always long enough for her to notice. And he always looked like he belonged to the earth more than to any people in it. One afternoon, as the woman stitched up a torn coat by the window, the girl leaned close and whispered, "Mama, I think he's not lonely. I think he's just waiting for someone who doesn't talk too loud." The woman didn't reply, but her needle paused. Just for a heartbeat, in this town of whispers and worn boots, no one talked about dreams. Not aloud, but that didn't stop the girl from having one. She told it only to her doll, who had lost one. But still listened just fine. And as she tucked the doll in that night, she whispered something so softly, even the walls couldn't hear. "Mr. Quiet Man should marry my mama. He'd never leave her. He'd stay." Far off, across the prairie, where the stars leaned low and close, a lantern flickered in the window of a ranch house, with just one chair by the fire, and a man sat there, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a horse. Not because anyone had asked, but because some things, like hope, don't have to be invited in. They just arrive. The wind had turned since that first snowfall. It no longer whispered, but hummed low like a memory too old to name. The sky, once a wide blue canvas, had settled into gray streaks and quiet storms. Life in Gallow's Bend carried on, as it always did, with slow footsteps and half-spoken greetings. But something soft had begun to stir, quiet as the hush before dawn. It started with a storm, not the kind that roars or breaks fences. This one came creeping across the prairie with a curtain of cold rain and silence, thick as wool. The woman and her daughter had set out early that day, their arms full of coats and patched trousers, bound for a homestead just east of town. A promise of payment for mending work too good to pass. They were nearly home when the sky broke open, and the wind began chasing them like a wild dog. They ran, the girl laughing at first, until the rain turned to ice, and her mother's shawl flew off. Into the fields. They found shelter in the only place they could dot, an old barn, sturdy but weathered, tucked at the edge of a split-rail fence that stretched like a spine across the ridge. The woman pushed open the door and nearly gasped. He was already there, the quiet man, the rancher. He stood beside a chestnut mare with one leg lifted, wrapping it gently. A cut bled slowly from the horse's side, and he worked with a steadiness that didn't waver, not even when he turned and saw them standing in the doorway, like two ghosts from the storm. He didn't shout, didn't ask what they were doing. He simply nodded once, toward the empty space near the hay, where it was dry and warmer than outside. They stepped in, the girl shivering beneath her damp shawl. He didn't speak again, but he did something that stayed in the woman's chest, like a burning coal. He took off his coat, thick, lined too big for either of them, and laid it gently over her daughter's shoulders. Then he went back to tending the horse, as if he'd always been doing so in the presence of silent visitors. That night, the woman lay awake long after her daughter fell asleep, her fingers curled tight around the hem of the coat they had brought home, still heavy with his scent, cedar, leather, and wind. It had been so long since a man had offered anything without expectation. So long since kindness didn't come with a cost. She didn't know what to do with it. In the weeks that followed, their paths crossed more often. She never sought him out, and he never lingered, but it was the kind of noticing that built slowly, like a song you remember from childhood, coming back to you in pieces. At the well, he waited behind her, letting her draw water first, though she hadn't seen him approach. At the market, he lifted her dropped basket without a word, setting it on the cart with a nod. Once, when her daughter's boot split open at the sole, he knelt beside her in the dust, took a thin strip of leather from his saddlebag, and bound it gently, not looking at the mother once, but nodding as the girl whispered a shy thank you. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't need it. The woman, who had learned to live on the edge of people's eyes, began to feel seen, not as someone broken, not as someone left behind, but as someone still here, still standing. There was a day bright and dry when the girl found a small wooden horse left on the windowsill outside the shop, carved with care, smooth and simple, no note, no signature. But they both knew, and the little girl smiled with her whole face. Something the town hadn't seen in too long. She had told him something once, weeks before, that her mama's hands used to be softer, that she used to sing lullabies, not hum them. She said it the way children do, believing the world listens. And maybe it did, because after that, the wooden horse came, and the next week, a basket of eggs left at their door, and after that, a sprig of dried lavender wrapped in twine, tucked into the seamstress's mailbox. Still, the woman didn't speak of him, not even to her daughter, but every evening, when the light dipped low and the wind rattled the window panes, she would glance at the horizon where the ranch house stood, tiny and alone, and she would breathe differently. One day, the girl asked the question. She wasn't looking at her mother when she said it. She was tracing circles in the dust with her finger, her brow furrowed in a thought too big for her years. Mama. The woman turned, her needle pausing in mid-stitch. You'd think he'd marry you? The thread slipped from her hand. The woman didn't answer. Couldn't so, the girl gently, like she was telling a secret to the wind, added, he don't smile at no one but you. The woman's eyes watered, but not from sadness, just tenderness. The kind that hurts a little, because you've kept it hidden so long, it forgot how to breathe. A few days later, they were passing through town, when the deputy, the same one who once offered smiles like favors, tipped his hat again. This time, his charm felt less sweet, more sour. He asked if she'd changed her mind about supper. She said no. He asked again. The rancher was there, just down the street, loading sacks of oats. He didn't look over, but he didn't leave either. She didn't need saving, but knowing someone would stand still if she needed him to, that was a different kind of protection. The seamstress, wise and worn from years of watching people become versions of themselves, offered the woman a cup of rosehip tea that night. You don't need to chase a man, she said. Just make sure you don't run from the one who's already walking beside you. The woman smiled at that, not because it was advice, but because it was true. One night, when the girl was sleeping, the woman sat outside on the porch steps, sewing by moonlight. She didn't hear his horse until it stopped near the edge of the road. He didn't speak. She didn't look up, but she felt his presence, quiet and patient, like a tree that offers shade without needing thanks. She stood, walked to the gate, and placed something on his saddle horn, a pie tin, still warm, wrapped in cloth. No note, no explanation. He nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and rode away. He came by the next week, not to the porch, but to the shop. He left a crate of firewood stacked neatly at the door, and on top, folded carefully, was the shawl she had lost in the storm. Sometimes, love doesn't begin with a kiss. Sometimes it begins with silence, with shared footsteps, with a wooden horse, and a shawl returned, and a coat given without asking. The little girl, watching from the window that evening, whispered again, not to her doll this time, but to the wind, "Mister, you should marry my mama. She's all I have now." He didn't hear her. Or maybe he did, because the next morning, they found a horseshoe nailed beside their door. A quiet promise, a wordless hope. The world had gone quiet beneath a heavy winter sky. Frost clung to the edges of every window pane in Gallow's Bend, curling like lace across the glass. The wind moved slower now, like it too was tired of carrying sorrow from house to house. Inside the dressmaker's shop, the fire crackled low. The woman sewed by the hearth, her hands moving with a rhythm that had grown familiar, almost meditative. Her daughter sat nearby, sketching with a blunt pencil on the back of a flour sack. Outside, the town huddled into itself, but not everyone stayed indoors. Some still rode out into the cold. Some still brought warmth where it was most needed. He didn't knock Dot. He never did. But she always knew when he had been there. It was in the way. The firewood appeared again and again, stacked neatly and dry despite the snow. Or how the broken fence post outside the shop was suddenly mended one morning, without a word. Or the fresh eggs wrapped in burlap on her windowsill. And one day, near the turn of the year, a letter, not written, Dot carved, in wood, a small plaque, rough at the edges, with 3 figures burned into it, a tall one, a small one, and one just slightly bent in the middle. She didn't ask what it meant. She didn't need to. The girl had fallen ill in early February. It started as a cough, then a fever, then something deeper, the kind of sickness that makes a mother's hands tremble, even when she tries to be brave. The seamstress offered her old herbs. The preacher's wife offered a prayer, but it was the rancher who rode into the blizzard for the doctor. He didn't ask, didn't wait to be told, just turned his horse toward the north, rode and vanished into the storm. Hours passed, then a day. The snow deepened. The girl's breathing shallowed, and the woman pressed cold cloths to her forehead and whispered old songs she could barely remember. Then, at dawn, hooves. He returned, coat frozen stiff, beard white with ice. But behind him, the doctor. The girl recovered slowly. Her laughter returned even slower, but it came, and so did something else. A change in the woman's heart. Not sudden, not loud, just certain. After that, she began walking out to the edge of town sometimes, not with errands, not with excuse, just to stand by the fence where his land began. Sometimes he was there, sometimes he wasn't, but she stood anyway, and once, he walked out to her, no words, just stood beside her in the wind, hands in his coat pockets, and looked out at the hills, as if to say, we don't need to speak to know. There was a moment, quiet, like everything else between them, that stayed with her more than any grand declaration ever could. She had gone to his ranch to return a borrowed kettle. The girl ran ahead, skipping. The door was open. The fire was warm. A second chair had been placed by the hearth, not new, but carefully mended, its legs sanded smooth, a cushion stitched in her favorite color. He didn't say anything when she entered. He simply looked at her, then down at the chair, then back. Again, an offering, a place, a home. That night, she held the wooden plaque in her lap and ran her thumb across the figures, and she wept, not because she was sad, but because she wasn't afraid anymore. The town began to notice, not in a cruel way, not this time, but with soft eyes, with nods, with quiet respect. The blacksmith gave her an extra horseshoe for free. The saloon singer nodded once when they passed, and whispered to her, "You found the rare kind, the kind that listens more than he talks." And the seamstress, wise and always watching, simply smiled and said, "Your girl don't look like she's waiting anymore. She looks like she's already home." The girl had drawn a new picture, stick figures again, but this time, for her, her mama, the rancher, and a dog she had decided they should get, whether they had one or not. She hung it up on the shop wall with pride. The rancher saw it one day, When he came to drop off flour, he didn't say a word, but the next morning, the girl found a pup sitting by their door, soft, shaggy, and wagging its tail like it had been waiting its whole life just for her. She named it Clover, because it felt like luck. The woman no longer dreamed in silence. She dreamed in warmth, in dinners shared at a small wooden table, in boots drying by the fire, in letters she might one day write that didn't end in goodbye. He came to the shop one evening with a basket of nails and a hammer. She raised an eyebrow. He nodded toward the steps. "They squeak," he said. 2 words. The first one she'd heard from him in days, and she smiled slow, deep, full of something that had no name. Sometimes love isn't loud. Sometimes it's just there, in fixed steps, in warm dogs, in hands that carry water, and hearts that carry silence well. One night, when the fire had burned low, and the shop was still, she stood at the window and whispered, "Thank you," to the dark dot, to the wind, to the man who never asked her to be anything but what she already was. A woman, a mother, a heart still learning to trust. And out there beyond the hill, beyond the fences, beyond the words, a lantern flickered on, in the rancher's window, like it always did, like it always would. Spring arrived like a soft confession. It didn't burst through the prairie with wildflowers and trumpets. No, it came slowly, in the drip of melting snow, the groan of thawing wood, the gentle creak of shutters, opening wider each morning, to let in just a little more light. And with the thaw, something else began to bloom, not in the fields, but in the spaces between people, in glances held longer, in hands brushing near the bread table at the market, in silence that no longer felt empty. Hope had returned to Gallows. Bend, but not loudly. Hope whispered, just like she always had, on the day of the spring fair. The town square smelled of honey bread and fresh sawdust. Ribbons danced from railings. Music floated over the dusty boardwalk like a memory that hadn't been heard in years. The little girl, hair tied back with a yellow bow, chased chickens between barrels and booths, her laughter weaving through the air like sunlight through cotton. Her mother watched from the dressmaker's booth, sleeves rolled up, fingers idly mending a hem while her eyes drifted toward the quiet figure leaning against the post by the mercantile, the rancher. He wore the same weathered coat, the same worn boots. But today, he looked steady, like a man who had made peace with the waiting. The deputy showed up just after noon, clean-shaven, boots polished, and a grin on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. He moved through the crowd like he still owned a piece of it, like his badge hadn't dulled since the day she first arrived in town. And then he saw her, the woman, leaning just outside the booth, sleeves dusted with chalk and thread. His grin widened. "Well," he said, loud enough for half the square too. "Here, ain't you, bloomed out nicely with spring." She turned slowly, not surprised, not smiling, just still. He tipped his hat. "You owe me a supper, remember?" She didn't answer. The rancher straightened behind her. No words, just one slow step forward, boots heavy on the wood, his eyes calm but unblinking. The deputy laughed low. "Ah, I see. Found yourself a shadow to hide behind." Still the rancher said nothing, but his presence spoke for him like thunder you feel in your bones. "Even before the rain comes," the woman stepped forward then, not hiding, not trembling, her voice, soft but certain, cut cleaner than any blade. "I don't owe you anything." And just like that, the deputy's smile cracked. He turned, muttered something under his breath, and walked off, boots clicking like pride breaking apart. She didn't look at the rancher right away, but when she did, his face was unreadable. Not angry, not proud, just still. And beside her, her daughter took his hand without asking, tiny fingers wrapping around 2 of his calloused ones. He looked down, gently surprised. The girl only said, "You stayed," and the rancher gave the smallest nod. The kind a tree might give the wind when it agrees, but doesn't need to say so. That night, after the fair, after the town had dimmed and the stars had come out to listen again, the woman stood outside her home, apron still dusted with sugar from the day. The sky was dark velvet, the kind that made you believe it could hold any secret without breaking. She heard the hooves before she saw him, and when he stepped down from his horse, he didn't come with flowers or fanfare, just a quiet breath, and words, worn but true. I've built a house with 2 chairs by the fire. She said nothing. I don't know much, he added, but I know the sound of a good silence. And you're the only one I want to share mine with. He didn't offer a ring, just the truth, and that was more precious than any gold. She nodded, not with giddy surprise, but with a peace so deep it felt like an old song returning home. The wedding was not grand. It happened 3 weeks later, beneath the large cottonwood, just beyond the ridge. The one that always swayed like it had secrets to tell. Only a handful of people came. The seamstress, the blacksmith, the preacher's wife, and of course, the saloon singer who brought wildflowers tied with ribbon and tears she didn't bother hiding. The girl stood between them, holding their hands. When the preacher asked if they promised love, the rancher didn't speak. He only looked at them both and nodded once, and that was enough. They moved into the ranch house, which had been slowly changing without anyone knowing. A new chair beside the fire, hooks for smaller coats, a second quilt on the bed, stitched in blues and yellows, a swing tied to the cottonwood, just high enough for a child to fly, and beside the hearth, a carved plaque, 3 figures tall, small, and one bent slightly in the middle. But now, a 4th, a dog, tail wagging, added in fresh lines. Life didn't become perfect, but it became honest, and that was better. There were still hard days, crops that wouldn't grow, horses that fell ill, storms that knocked shutters loose, but there was warmth now, and laughter that didn't feel borrowed, and a quiet man who kissed the top of his wife's head each morning like it was a prayer. One evening, the girl, now taller, braver, wearing boots too big for her yet, asked if she could write something on the back of the plaque. The rancher nodded. She took a coal pencil and wrote 5 words in crooked, careful letters. He heard the whisper, "Mama." And when strangers came through town and asked how a woman, alone with nothing, found such a love, the seamstress would smile and say, she didn't find it. She tended it, watered it, waited for it. Because sometimes, the best kind of love isn't the kind that sweeps in like thunder. It's the kind that grows like a tree, quiet, steady, rooted deep in the soil of hope. Maybe someone you know is still waiting for that kind of love. Not loud, not fast, just patient and real. Maybe that someone is you. And maybe, just maybe, this world still makes room for quiet hearts to find each other. If we dare to hope, if we listen for the whisper.